We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
I'm Emma Waddington.
And I'm Chris McCurry. And today we are privileged and thrilled to have Matthieu Villatte as our guest today. Matthieu is a PhD psychologist and an author and a trainer and a coach. He obtained his doctorate in psychology in France, where he was trained as a clinical psychologist, and then he moved to the United States in 2010 to complete a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Nevada, where I studied along with Steve Hayes, one of Matthieu's mentors as well. And he has worked as an assistant professor and researcher at the University of Louisiana, at the Evidence-Based Practice Institute at Seattle, and at Bastyr University. And he is the author of numerous books and chapters on mindfulness, acceptance, experiential therapies, and contextual behavioral science. And he's also a peer-reviewed trainer in acceptance and commitment therapy, which is near and dear to my heart, Emma's. And we'll have some information in the show notes about some trainings that Matthieu is doing and will do, and you'll want to check those out. So without further ado, welcome, Matthieu Villatte.
Thank you for having me. It's always nice to talk to you, Chris and Emma. It's been a while, so it's particularly nice to be with you today.
Yes, it's our pleasure. So, 10-unit course on spirituality, and we'll have the link to that in the show notes. In spirituality, and as we record this the day after Easter and the day after the death of Pope Francis.
I noticed that when I woke up, I was like, well.
Yeah, it was on the radio when I woke up. So religion, having been, just had Easter, is big right now. And it's big in the United States. It's become a very political issue in many ways. But it seems in recent years, I've seen a lot of polling that shows that, at least in the United States, people are identifying themselves as spiritual without necessarily identifying themselves as religious. And I'd love you to speak more to that distinction and how that has come about and where that seems to be heading.
Yeah, it's a really interesting distinction to explore. I've had this conversation with people who are religious, people who are not religious and consider themselves spiritual, with people who are not religious and don't consider themselves spiritual. It's there's something there that I think you can't avoid. I think as a human being, it's like what I say about philosophy, because the topic of spirituality relates to philosophy a lot, as I think we will see together. It's like either you might think that you're not interested in philosophy, but you are doing philosophy. You necessarily have some thoughts about life and the purpose and meaning of your own life. And you can't avoid those kind of questions. You don't have to read philosophy. You don't have to know anything about philosophy from scholars and great authors, but you necessarily have some worldview and ideas about life. It's the same thing with spirituality. You might not believe in God or in a particular God or a particular entity. You may not belong to a community that shares the same system of beliefs about what's the meaning of life. Is there something after we die and things like that? But you can't really having questions about meaning and purpose of life, what connects you to the rest of the world. I like a definition that's relatively simple that we use in psychology to define spirituality. It can be defined as the integration of our relationship to ourselves, others, and a higher power. And the higher power can be God, of course, for the people who are religious. But it can also be, the universe or the world or nature or your values, something that's not necessarily clearly defined, but bigger than all that. And all these relationships being integrated. So we find this concept, of interconnection. Everything is connected, or spirituality in the end is when you feel in harmony with everything in your life. And when you think of it this way, I would say, so I'm not religious. I didn't reject religion. I was not raised in religion. I'm from France, where there's, of course, a history with religion, but is not a country that is organized around religion. There's a culture that's related to religion historically. But for me, it's interesting definition, because when you think of it this way, then I think it speaks to everybody. Is there a time in your life when you felt like everything was harmonious? Can you relate to that? Like a moment when you were at the right time, at the right place, with the right people, doing the right thing. You were who you were supposed to be. People saw you the way you see yourself. You see that sense of harmony with everything? Sometimes it can come as a one moment, very special and insight, a moment of transcendence. A moment that often people will qualify as spiritual. So it can be religious. In psychology, we tend to think that it can be, the religion in the end is a way of expressing spirituality, is a way of finding spirituality.
Hey listeners, we're Emma
And Chris.
and we're excited to share our new children workbooks. Just in Case Sits with Anxiety follows Justin on his first babysitting job and a case of the what ifs. The Glum twins unhooked from sadness tells the story of Dolores and Tristan as birthday plans go off the rails.
Both books are designed for kids ages 8 to 12 and are packed with playful, hands-on activities based on acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. They help kids understand that emotions like anxiety and sadness are totally normal, and that we don't have to let them stop us from doing what matters. Each book also includes a special section for parents and caregivers on how to support kids through tough emotional moments. They're fun, evidence-based, and full of heart.
Know a kid facing tough feelings of anxiety or sadness? These books are for them. Available now in bookstores and online. Thank you all for your support.
In your work, in your research, you found that there are a lot of benefits to spirituality.
Yeah, and the research in spirituality is like to grow now. It's been a while that there are psychologists, but also researchers from different disciplines interested in this domain. There's been a lot of research related to religions, for example, the benefit of praying or belonging to a religious community. But then it has grown to explore more the psychological processes, as I was saying, that might transcend religion. And so it can include, practice of mindfulness, the sharing values in a community. It can be having a sense of what matters to you and define in a way that's not just outcomes and goals. So you always have a sense of direction. So, the trick is that when you define spirituality in terms of psychological processes, you're going to realize that in a way, all research in psychology is about spirituality. In ACT, for example, and you talked about ACT on your podcast, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, we're particularly interested in the notion of self and values. And they are defined as processes of transcendence. And yet it's not like a religious or spiritual model per se. It's a psychological model, but it's a model in which we're interested in how people find connections with everything. So, I would argue there is research in spirituality, especially models that expand their theories to existential concepts, I would say. So therapies like ACT, they are grounded in humanism and existentialism, also behavioral psychology, of course. I think that definitively define the processes that are involved in spirituality in that way. Yeah.
It sounds like it even comes down to everyday things like recovering from illness and other forms of resilience. And when life, hits pretty hard, spirituality is a protective factor, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah. It brings me back to 15 years ago when I was in Reno, Stephen Hayes lab. And at some point we worked on trying to get a grant for research. I joined Jackie Pistorilo's work on suicide, prevention of suicide, and somehow we're trying to get a grant on connectedness as a protective factor against suicide. And it's interesting, right? Again, it's a sense of illustration of connection here, going back to the past and like, oh yeah, you're asking me this question. And then I'm brought back to the past. That's an example of spirituality, I would say. It's like, oh wow, you were in Reno too, and you're in Seattle now, I'm in Seattle, and then brings me back to the past. And oh wow, that's an example of, being open to that ongoing process. And so at that time, I remember studying the literature on connectedness. So basically how people find connected to others, and how it can be a protective factor against suicide. I think it's something that people know intuitively, but you can even find easily in the literature or even memes on social media. It's not enough to be around people. You need to feel connected to the people. You can sometimes feel very lonely when there's a lot of people around you, but and you can feel very connected sometimes alone at home. It's a matter of feeling connected. That's a very important factor so in that case, I was to prevent suicide. But even more broadly, it's a factor of resilience, and sometimes in surprising ways. I'm only able to cite the exact study, but can easily find that research is pretty well known, that after dramatic events, I remember that it's been studied around 9/11, that surprisingly people the rate of suicide tends to decrease around those times. And you think, oh, well, how could that happen when it's something terrible that happens? But it's often because there is a sense of sharing an experience with others, with the community. So you would expect that after your city wins the Super Bowl or something like that, people are going to come together. That's relatively easy to understand, but it can happen even in dramatic events. And I guess, again, it's something that can be understood by, I think, almost intuitively by everybody. When there is a dramatic event in a family, loss of a person, but people will still find connection. It can be at the funeral, it can be in sharing memories. Now, don't get me wrong, there can also be moments when there are conflicts, of course. But what I'm saying is that it's not what happens per se, it's the fact that it brings people together. There's an opportunity to connect with others. And that's really seems to be a strong factor of resilience. For example, people will go through grieving much better if they're able to share that grief with other people, to be able to talk about it. But if they feel like it's something that they have to move on from, and especially when there's a grief, and people don't experience grief in a linear way. So of course, at the beginning, often they find people around them to support them, but then, you forget because time goes on, and then you're like, but I'm still feeling sad, I'm still feeling depressed, but there's no one I can talk to because people are going to say, it's over, I should move on. And now I'm starting to feel disconnected. And that's often when people struggle the most. So it's definitely something that is extremely important for well-being.
I love this definition that you've given us of spirituality. I think that the thing that struck me the most is this idea of harmony in spirituality, be it harmony through that sense of connection or harmony from perspective that everything seems to be in flow, everything seems to be going well. There's something quite, like you said, transcendental, but that feels like a moment in your life where you might experience something quite profound. I remember in one of Kelly Wilson's workshops, he talked about being in a Quaker meeting, actually, with one of his daughters who's called Emma, and he wanted time to just freeze. She was sitting on his lap, and I don't think anything else was happening particularly, but just that moment felt just so perfect. And you describe that as sort of harmony and something that feels transcendental and quite spiritual. And I can see how that can be something that we want to grasp onto and we don't want to let go. And immediately, obviously, our brain kicks in and starts to struggle with the fact that we're going to lose that moment. So when we think about spirituality as not just that moment, as something you're describing, if we sort of practice certain things like mindfulness or different types of meditation, or if we are some of the concepts that we use in ACT, if we're more intentional about living by our values, exercising what truly matters to us, that's where spirituality can sort of transcend more than one moment, I guess. Can you speak to that? Because I think the complexity with that moment of harmony is that it feels a little too small. Like I want more of that.
Yeah.
And spirituality obviously is something that we're hoping to. It feels like almost like a muscle.
Yeah. It's exactly what you mean. I think it's a very interesting and important point. Often when we talk about moments of spirituality, it's already a bit of a problem to say a moment of spirituality, because it assumes that it's in that moment that everything connects. But by definition, if everything connects, everything connects. So it means that even when I feel like things are not connected, then they are connected. It's a matter of paying attention to how it's connected.
Yes.
It's really more a matter of developing awareness. And that's where you can see the connection with mindfulness. People who practice mindfulness, they will say there are moments when they feel harmony and calm, and they can sense the flow and everything. But if you think that that's the experience that you need to have to validate that you're functioning well, you're starting to treat mindfulness as a performance, and you're looking for the outcome. And it's the same thing with spirituality. If you expect that you're going to feel a certain way, that gets very tricky. Now you start to prevent the flow from happening. You're trying to hang on to something that precisely is not dynamic, is not changing. You have to appreciate that it's changing. I really like the image of trying to grasp water, like in a stream, for example. You can feel the stream, but try to grasp the water and you feel something, but then you also realize that there's nothing that you can grasp. I think when you think of it this way, you're like, okay, spirituality is about putting your hand in the stream and feeling that, and that's all you have to do, in fact. And then, you will have moments that are very intense, very incredible, where this moment where it feels like it's strange, because it's like, it's almost like you sense that interconnection more. And if you practice more, just like you practice mindfulness more, if you pray, if you read, text that connects you to these topics, probably will have more moments like that, feel more intense. I'm not even sure that's necessarily a good thing. I don't know. I'm very agnostic about it, very open, because sometimes I wonder, is that what we're trying to do, is having more moments like that on a continuous level, like this sense of flow all the time? Or if we try to do that actually sort of defeats the purpose. Are we not supposed to experience, and again, it's a coincidence, but it's interesting to link it to Easter and the whole story around it, you die and then resurrection. Isn't that necessary to experience loss, and then it's coming back with a different form? We have the same concept in ACT, in acceptance and commitment therapy, the concept of creative hopelessness. Don't know if you ever had the opportunity to talk about it in your podcast, but it's the same idea. You think you're losing everything because you cannot control your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings. There's no hope. And then through that acknowledgement that you cannot control your feelings, something else grows. Now you find connection with your values. And then the paradox is that now you feel great. Oh, well, then that's what I needed to do in order to feel great. Yeah, but if you think of it this way, it's not going to work well. So it's really the paradox. It seems like you have to experience hopelessness in order to find something else. If you're going through hopelessness thinking this is what I need to do in order to find something else, you won't experience hopelessness. So perhaps it's the same thing with those spiritual experiences. If you're always trying to have them, let's say you go to church to connect with your community and pray and find God. But imagine that you're doing that with the hope that you're going to feel that intense thing. Or you go to a meditation retreat and you think, it was a great moment of connection and I felt really... or you go to space, and you come back and you say, I found love. Like a few days ago, it was an example like that also. It's like there's a search for that special experience. I think it can be very counterproductive for spirituality.
Well, it's like they say, after the Enlightenment, the laundry.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
We just can't hang out there.
Yeah.
In fact, if we did, it would probably fade out.
Yeah.
Like when you look at a star in the sky, it fades out because you have to keep turning your eyes to get the star back because it saturates the cones in your eyes or the rods, whichever the ones. It does. But no, it's again, it's a transcendent thing because creative hopelessness, where you're stuck in the hopelessness, allows you to get out of that hopelessness by seeing that there's something outside of that.
Yeah.
In my practice, people would say, I'm confused. I would say, are you certain you're confused?
You find certainty in confusion.
Then confusion becomes this thing. And for those of you, our listeners who are not watching this video, I'm using my hands, but your confusion is this, but then, but confusion becomes content within a larger context.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was saying in my training the other day, when you take concepts like transcendence, at some level, you might think it's very abstract, very complex. I have no idea what it means, but you can also look at it as very basic sense. Look at the etymology and you find, actually, it's actually pretty simple. How can you go beyond the limitations of the concrete? So you're in a room and it's closed and you want to go out, but you cannot go out because it's closed. Well, I can't, right? That's the end of the story. Well, let's see. I really want to be outside right now. I really want to be outside. And now I realize as I'm saying that, I am a bit outside. I am thinking about what's outside, right? Even in the desire of being outside, the frustration of being locked in, there is a connection with the outside. So that's the idea. Transcending means going beyond, right? I should have checked my etymology dictionary just before, but it's basically traveling through or something like that. So how can we do that? Well, we have a very powerful way of doing things like that as humans. It's like we think, we feel, and that's ways that we go beyond the limitations of whatever. Yeah, sure. There's technology. Like right now, we can connect. Chris, you're not very far. We could meet for a coffee easily here in Seattle, but it might be more difficult. Okay, we have technology, but as soon as the session will be over, think about you. And it's the same thing with people who are gone forever and people I will never meet, but I know exist and they matter to me. You mentioned mentors. I have mentors that I've never met. I have mentors who were dead before I studied psychology, but like Carl Rogers has been a great source of inspiration over the past few years. I love to watch his videos. Sometimes I find a lot of inspiration from just listening to his interviews. When did he die? It was before I studied psychology, I think. But, there's a connection. So it transcends the limitations of whatever, really, time, space. But it's not, you can think of it as something magical. You can think of it that way. From a psychological perspective, it can be actually pretty concrete, but it's easy to dismiss it because it might be like, well, okay, you're thinking about them, but that's not really that special. Yes, just wait a minute, just slow down a little bit. Isn't that special? Think about it for a moment. You can bring to life in terms of your psychological experience anything you want, really. Anything that's important. Like imagine Carl Rogers, if he had projected himself in the future, thinking like 20, 30 years from now, there will be 3 people talking about me on a Monday morning and talking about spirituality. Wow, that's crazy to think that. It's happening right now,
I love this. I love this because I love thinking about spirituality and this ability to transcend from a less sort of hippie way, is that our incredible mind has this ability, without religion, without needing God. I mean, if you have a God, that's good too, but you don't need a God to be able to do this. And this ability to think beyond you and your experience and what you think, this ability to want to connect with the psychological experience of someone else, that expansiveness is so powerful and so good for us. Like it's so important to have that ability to
think beyond your perspective. I'm reading a book in preparation for a conversation that we're going to be having in a few weeks' time on conflict resilience. And that's all about being able to get comfortable sitting with other people's perspectives, even when it's really upsetting and confronting. That is a muscle we need to build. And I think that ability requires what we're talking about here, really being able to transcend your perspective, your emotions, your version of the world is critical to humans. And it kind of takes me into this idea of prosocial behaviors and how important they are, but they really are. So the birthplace is this ability to transcend, to see beyond you, see that you're not the only person in the world, see that others matter is deeply important to us as humans, to our well-being, our psychological and our physical well-being, but also I see it as something critical to our survival as a species. Like, it's really important that we cooperate, and that is, something that has allowed us to evolve. And in that is this transcendence, I think. The spirituality is in this.
Again, like I was saying earlier, it's interesting because when you analyze the process of transcendence, like I did earlier, in a relatively simple way, then you realize that it is at the core of pretty much everything we do, which again, by definition, should be the case, because if it's transcendent, it's everywhere. Is there something very strange about that? It's like, oh, transcendence, what is it? It's a special. If it's transcendent, by definition, it's going to be everywhere. So it's even in the mundane moments, preparing coffee. And what's transcendent about that? Well, I don't know. I just have to think a bit about it. It won't be hard to find, actually, So, of course, conflict resolution, whether it's with a friend, a partner, about a daily life issue, or if it's something much more important, meaningful, and at the larger scale between countries and people. It's always going to be about how can we bring together what seems to not come together. If you think of it just this way, you'll realize every moment pretty much is like that. How can I bring together what doesn't seem to come together? And then you find a way, and that's that moment of connection, of transcendence, of integration. And it can feel really, really great. It's like problem solving. When you solve a problem, you have that little boost of dopamine, which is part of why we tend to like those experiences, by the way. It's like, oh yeah, I get it now. Moments of insight. We see that in therapy a lot too, right? Like, I get it. I understand now. And it's like, oh, wow, that's moment of it. And then again, you don't understand anymore because there's that new perspective. So you have to be prepared to transcend the next moment. What just happened then? You were saying we don't need a God or religion. I'm very agnostic about that, because you could also argue that everything we're talking about right now, like this ability of thinking, transcending from psychological perspective, it's given by God. And from a scientific perspective, you cannot argue against that. That's not a problem at all. So if someone said, no, actually, that's what you're saying here for me, it's the evidence of God, I would say, yeah, I get it. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. From my perspective, it would be overlapping, I guess. And that's where it becomes really interesting. Again, the process of transcendence. You can communicate with someone who has a system of beliefs that's very different. If you think literally, it's different, right? But at this process level, you recognize that we're doing the same thing here. And it's interesting, because I have clients who are religious, and sometimes I find myself advocating for their religion when they are in more of a faith crisis. And it's weird because, I don't share their belief system, but I recognize the psychological process inside of that. And so it's not like I'm saying to them, no, you should stick with religion. It's not exactly like that. It's more like I was going to say I play the devil's advocate, but I'm not going to say that. But it's like I try to help them recognize what's the benefits in terms of the psychological process. Like, for example, what do you think might be the point of doing that? Say, for example, there's a special holiday and a client is dreading having to go through that. And I'd explore with them perhaps the tradition around that. Tell me more about that. Like, if it's religion I don't know anything about, what's around that? What are the traditions in your family? Is it meaningful? What do you like about it? What you don't like about it? Do you know where it comes from? And that when we do that, it creates transcendence. It creates a connection to the history and the why. And it's interesting because I'm very agnostic about it. I don't know what's going to happen. If the client comes out of that process and say, I'm sick of that. I'm sick of that, those traditions, and I feel like it's dogmatic, and they end up growing out of it. Okay, but they might also embrace their belief system and their traditions better now because they reconnect. They have a better understanding of why. So what I'm saying is that what I find really helpful, and that's, I guess, my love for psychology in general, is that it allows you to go anywhere people behave and live, And so I think in the spirit of the concept of your podcast, the dirty little secret, it's for people in their lives, but I think it's also a message for therapists, perhaps teachers also. And it's like, well, this area that you might feel like you cannot go because it would be too private or it's not scientific. And who am I to talk about religion with the client? I'd say, well, think of that as a psychological process, as you realize that you have much more to say or to contribute to, and also to learn.
So with that, I'm thinking about the word again, transcendence, and perhaps what I'm thinking is that when we define it the way you've been defining it, it's finding that interconnectedness.
Mm-hmm.
The only way to be able to find interconnectedness with things, with people, with concepts, is to go in, to explore them, to experience them. Like you were saying, being inside a room, inside your ideas, inside your perspective of the world, doesn't allow for that as much. And I guess that in a way, you were talking about religion and being, able to talk about religion even when we are agnostic or not. But also, if I think of the world at large, our ability to be open to other people's view of the world, particularly at times like now, where there's strong feelings and a real rejection, a real apathy to seeing different views, because those can sort of elicit very strong emotions. But that kind of gets in the way of our ability to feel interconnected to a wider community. If we're thinking from a pro-social point of view, this ability to spirituality to apply to our ability to be more interconnected to different groups, different humans who are having different experiences of the world. We need to be willing to feel discomfort, feel confronted, feel challenged. That space that you're describing with your clients, it applies to all of us. And it feels like an invitation that, spirituality has all these pros and so good for us. And you can see how, like you're describing some of the research around spirituality. But even from like I was talking to before, as humans, it's really important for us to be able to transcend our version of the world, to feel more interconnected for our well-being, but also for the well-being of the planet, for the well-being of our communities. Yeah, that feels like I hadn't quite connected before with our conversation, spirituality and some of those more pro-social behaviors with this sense of transcendence, the way we're doing today.
This idea of trusting the process, it's a common thing we hear kind of everywhere now. I don't know when it started, but it definitely seems very common now, especially in therapy. It's something we often say. What do we mean when we say that? We basically mean that it's ongoing, You might think that you're not there yet, but in some ways you look back and realize that, oh, actually it was already there. It's what we were saying about creative hopelessness. If you think of it as, well, right now it's bad, but it will be good. You're treating what you're experiencing right now as not as a worthy life experience. And what does that mean, a worthy life experience, meaningful life experience? It means an experience that connects to everything. It doesn't mean I feel good in the sense of, it's always, there's a paradox, because as soon as you find a meaning, in a way you feel good, but okay, you experience loss, grief. Doesn't feel good, right? Okay. But can it feel meaningful? Yes, definitely. In fact, there's an easy way of checking that, realizing that it's meaningful. Is if you ask people, would you like to not feel sad when you think of that person you love who is not here anymore? Would you like to not feel anything anymore? Now, granted, some people will say that as part of their process of going through grief. But I would say usually people realize that if they didn't feel sad, they would feel disconnected. There would be something missing. And so for me, that's the idea with trusting the process, is that in a way, you don't really have to do anything, but observe, but become aware. So even when, you were saying, well, especially now when the society were divided, and honestly, I don't know if we're more divided now than we were in the past. It's very hard to tell, because sometimes it's a matter of perspective, where, of course, we're more aware of things that are happening in the moment, but I don't know. Let's say it's the case. Perhaps it is the case. There are phases, in a process, whether it's a society or an individual, where, things don't feel like connected. Every day I have moments like that where I feel like everything's falling apart in a way, in small ways, sometimes in big ways. I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I don't know anything anymore. Maybe I'm not helpful. Maybe I look back at my life and I feel like it's just a succession of failure. I feel like I can really tell that story. And then later, the same day, maybe I can tell the exact opposite story. What grows over time, and that's what I expect to see with my clients, for example, is that there is an awareness at the same time as you're observing these ups and downs, or these divisions, or you feel like you are not connecting. Where is our country going? What about the planet? And at the same time as you're concerned about that, so it's not like you dismiss it, it's not like, well, don't worry about it, there's nothing. No, there's something happening. But at the same time as you're observing that, and you're maybe even doing things concretely, you also remember that we've been through that before, or I've been through that before, or there's a sense that other people have been through that. The more you experience those ups and downs with you, and developing at the same time that awareness, the more when you're in the down, you realize that, well, but there is also up. And then the more, when you're in the up, you also remember there's also a down. And so it feels like it's not really like it gets average. It doesn't become flat. I think sometimes people end up in that place for a while. Then they start to detach themselves from their experiences. They're like, well, what's the point? I know, tomorrow is going to be great. And then the next day is going to be bad. And then what's the point? So they have this movement of all disconnection. But I think progressively you just cannot, you cannot help. It's like I was saying earlier, even if you don't care about philosophy, you're still doing philosophy. If you don't care about spirituality, you can't help. But try to find meaning in life, live, feel. I think it's unavoidable. If you're a human being, you're feeling, you're developing meaning, and you want things to come together. So that's the most important in the end. It's the desire to find integration. And I don't even have to teach that to people. Usually it's really more to help them realize that they can't help but want that.
I was just thinking it's not even a matter of finding meaning, it's recognizing meaning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's there.
Yeah.
The integration is there, the meaning is there, but we have blinders on, or we're focusing on some small part of the picture and not recognizing that, well, there's more to that, whether it's historical or, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And, I think it's you can say that it's one of the key functions of religions and other communities or organizations, systems of belief that try to bring people together and teach them how to do that. Right? It's, you go to a yoga class, you go to a mindfulness training, and it teaches you how to recognize that, how to find that process. So I think, we have to give credits to religions for finding a system, where, how are we going to manage to connect people? Well, maybe we can share beliefs. Maybe how can we teach that? Well, maybe there's a system of, religions have different ways, but maybe a school for kids so that they learn history, they will read the religious text. And Well, you see functionally how it works, right? It's like, how can we help people find meaning? The problem can come when we become rigidly attached to the rules inside those systems of beliefs. And it can happen in religion, but it can happen in anything. I've seen it also in science. When people start to be very, very enamored with their theories or with their communities, and they start to reject information that comes from, you don't read the papers that come from a theory that is not yours, or you read it, but just from the perspective of criticizing it. Of course it happens. All humans do that with anything. Why is that a problem? Well, because you could say it interferes with the transcendence process. By definition, transcendence is dynamic. It's open. It's open and integrative. So it's like always something new to connect with. But if your system of belief says, no, you should not be curious. You should not seek information outside our community. You should not question the existence of God. You should not ask why we do this or that. If that's in the rules, then that's going to be a problem. It's not going to help transcendence. And I think it's probably what happens. I'm not expert in the sociology of religion, so I'm going to say I think it's probably something that's been studied and it's obvious to experts. But it probably often starts like that, with an idea that we have a great way of connecting people and it's open, and then you want to stick with that because it seems to work, and then you want to keep it this way and maintain the same tradition, so to make sure that people will find transcendence. But that attachment to a certain way, or a certain interpretation of text, for example, that goes, to me, against the process of transcendence. On the other hand, there are religious people who see it the way I'm describing, is say, no, actually, it's all about questioning. It's all about reflecting and wondering what it means. Like, you should read the Bible and ask yourself, what does it mean? Of course, you should ask yourself if you really believe in God or not, if you question the existence of God, because that's actually how you strengthen your faith. That's not how you undermine your faith. That's how you strengthen your faith. It's the same thing with values in ACT. You can do some work to clarify your values. Realize something important to me is to connect with the world, explore the world, something really important to me. Okay. And now I'm just going to focus on the actions that I can do to focus on my values. Well, no, I think you have to continue to reflect on your values if you want them to be valuing. It's like every day, maybe you wake up and you're like, do I still care about that? Is that still important? Am I not fooling myself? Am I just caring about that because it's in my community, because people told me that, because my parents? I think that's very healthy, actually, to question that. When you question, you keep the process dynamic, open, fluid. It's the flow, right? And again, I would say you don't even have to force yourself to do it. It's more like being okay with having those doubts. I think it's very healthy. And that's what sometimes, often, perhaps, I don't know, is limited in some communities, some systems of beliefs, where out of fear that the whole thing is going to fall apart.
Yes, I agree. I think it's very bold to be curious and asking yourself these questions. I think it takes a lot of courage, because in the same way that you described earlier in our conversation, that it feels so good to be right, to suddenly having figured something out, we can hold on very tightly to our version of the world and let you sort of live in these sort of echo chambers where we're just listening to our own perspectives being basically repeated, be it through, the media that we read, the people that we speak to. And I think it does take a lot of courage to step outside that, and requires us to feel comfortable. And I think when you describe it from a values perspective, like really being able to identify that matters to us, like being able to, like, curiosity for me is a value. Being curious about other people's worlds. I think that's one of the things that brought me into psychology. Like, I love to hear people's stories, but also how they make sense of the world. Even the most sort of radically different versions of the world. I love that, because for me, it's it's like a puzzle. It's like making sense of how do you come to that conclusion? And how does that make sense? Tell me more. Like that is what I love the most about my job, is I get to see that from the inside out. And often we don't. Often we don't get to ask those questions. And it's a shame. I think, as humans, we're missing out when we don't ask those questions, but it can feel really bold. Like in the intimacy of our therapy room, it can feel quite safe. And I talk to my clients about what a privilege it is to get this opportunity. But really, it's a shame that we don't get to do it more, because to get to see the inside of somebody's world is incredibly connecting. And from a spiritual perspective, it opens you up.
Yeah. It's perhaps the people who have more inclination for openness and curiosity, and are more likely to travel the world and read different books and learn different languages, and others might seem on the surface that they are less interested, but maybe they're a little more focused on one thing, and that they're going to explore in depth throughout their lives. And so I think there's different ways that is going to be expressed. But in the end, I think there's always a desire of connecting everything. That's the hypothesis that it's not my specific hypothesis, mine, but that's the one I believe in, is that in the end, that's something that's sort of wired, we cannot help but want to find meaning, and that everything comes together. And that's probably why we can end up in echo chambers, like you said, because for a while, at least, it does feel like everything comes together. I think it's a trajectory that's pretty common. It's something that's people from the ACT community who are listening will probably recognize. You go to your first ACT conference and you're like, wow, that's amazing. It's so open and we can talk to people. And I did an exercise in a workshop where we were looking at each other's eyes. When you leave that and you're like, wow, this is incredible. And I want to share that with the world and everything. It happens in a lot of different, spiritual communities or, that sense of connecting and at the same time openness. But then you want to reproduce that. You found your place, you found your community, where it's like that. And you don't like it when people are not like that. I've heard that, for example, people who learn nonviolent communication, they often struggle when they go back to their life, their families, because people don't speak the language, they are not empathetic. They don't express their emotions the same way. And it can be frustrating. And in the FAP, the functional analytic psychotherapy, it's also very common. You learn to connect, to find intimacy in a certain way. And then there's a mixed feelings, on some level, you'd like to spread that to other people. But then there's also I don't want to be around those people who cannot connect, who are not open and everything. But you see how you're starting to drift away from the idea of interconnection, right? It's like, well, okay, but if you start to not talk to some people because they're not like that, you don't consider them as part of humanity. They don't deserve your empathy because, okay, fine. I mean, you can do what you want. That's totally fine. It can be part of a process. I'm not saying that I feel the same level of connection, humanity with everybody, but I recognize it as a limitation of my current ability. It could be even just in this moment or at the stage of development. I don't make a statement thinking there are some people who don't deserve my empathy. No, because when I say it this way, for me, it's more like I am actually interfering with my own transcendence. That's how I'm seeing it. And I think we have to be careful not to consider that there are systems or communities that are necessarily immune to the echo chamber effect. I think because we're like that, when things come together well, then you can end up being fused with it. You're like in a relationship, you meet someone, you fall in love, and it's amazing, and it feels like I've been looking for you for my whole life, and you understand me, I understand you, and everything. And it can also become at some point too enmeshed. But again, I would say trust the process. Eventually, you'll need that break in that shell. You'll need something to be different, or you'll see it. You realize, well, actually, you're a bit different. You're not exactly the way you're there. It's how you manage that. Just like with communities, how do we manage when we start to feel like, wait, something is missing here, something is not adding up, or our leaders don't have integrity. I thought they were great, they're not great. Those moments of disruption are very interesting because they are moments of growth. again, I go back to what I was saying about feeling like the limitations of the concrete. It's everything falls apart. I thought there was the perfect community, and wait, maybe it's the moment when you can grow. Maybe the moment when the community can grow. Wait, there's a moment of transformation. Maybe we can find transcendence in a greater way than we thought. There's a quote from a movie, To the Wonder. It's a movie by Terrence Malick, who did quite a few movies about spirituality. One of the most famous is the Tree of Life. It directly addresses that. But there is another movie that he did, To the Wonder, and there is one of the characters is a priest who is going through a faith crisis. It's played by Javier Bardem. And there is a quote that you can hear in the trailer. It's often in my mind because of that. It says, "You fear your love has died. Perhaps it's waiting to transform into something higher." I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if it was a line written for the movie or if it's something taken from, I don't know. But it's often in my mind, It goes back to this idea of creative hopelessness, It's okay to feel that. You feel your love has died, but perhaps it's waiting to transform into something higher. It's a religious line, meant to be religious, specifically Christian. Not Christian, but it speaks to me a lot. It's like, okay, you feel like everything's falling apart. You feel like your parents disappoints you because they are not who you think they were, or your mentor doesn't have the integrity you thought, or whatever. Our leaders are disappointed. Yes, okay, but stay engaged with the process. Keep caring. What do you want? What's important? What's missing? Stay engaged. Basically, stay alive and see what happens. I find that really incredibly powerful when you can develop that attitude.
So powerful. And I kept thinking as you were saying, because I've just come back from this trip, and, in Buddhism, they talk about no mud, no lotus. And yeah, in that place of struggle, there can be a lot of growth. And what a beautiful invitation. Well, thank you. This has been really inspiring. I'm feeling like I really want to be more curious to this process of transcendence. And this I really enjoyed hearing about that desire to find the connection, being between things, between people, between moments, between experiences. Like, that felt really powerful. And it makes a lot of sense to me. And I can see that why that can bring a lot of meaning, but can give a lot of life.
Yeah, it's obviously a topic that I never get tired of, and perhaps that's the most important for me. It's like I can reflect on that, and I guess you find meaning in the search for meaning, as I think Viktor Frankl was saying something like that, right? It's the idea is that you're trying to find something, and then you realize, oh wait, I am finding it. I'm in the process, and it's very relieving, right? Because you don't feel. What develops over time is that you don't feel like you need anything in particular. You just need to be alive. And then, of course, there are moments that feel more special, like right now, like for an hour talking with you. And I guess perhaps because we are humans and we particularly like to connect with other people, not just connect, but connect with people. And that process of exploration, like we went through, reflecting, sharing our perspectives, yeah, it is definitely very special.
It has been special. Thank you, Matt. And again, we'll have some links in the show notes for people who want to explore this further.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets, or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.